Today I did have one, I think, relatively simple but somewhat meandering thought connected with Sukkot, which is based on thinking about the idea of shade, of tzel, uh, and the idea of being in the shade of something. Because obviously, one of the things that a sukkah provides for us is shade, which is a very valuable form of shelter in this part of the world. It's something that if you grow up in other parts of the world, you don't necessarily totally appreciate, but almost at any time of year, but especially outside of the winter months, the difference between being in direct sun here and being in the shade really is quite significant. It can be literally the difference between being miserable and feeling quite comfortable. And so shade is a very precious commodity in some sense, and the sukkah provides shade. We even have a proof text for that in Tanakh. In Sefer Yonah, which many of us read in the afternoon on Yom Kippurim recently, we have this pasuk, "Vayetze Yonah min ha'ir vayeshev mikedem la'ir vayas lo sham sukkah vayeshev tachteha batzel ad asher yireh ma yihye ba'ir." So Yonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city, and there he made himself a sukkah, a booth, and sat under it in the shade till he could see what would become of the city. And then, the kikayon grows, and the kikayon also gives him shade. This whole passage is about shade, actually, and the shade is somehow connected with Yonah's enjoyment. So it's really everything wrapped up that a sukkah provides shade, and we enjoy the shade. And that's one of the things that we get from it. It's clearly not the only thing we get from sukkah, but shade is one of the precious things that sukkah provides for us. And that just gets us thinking a little bit about other instances where we have the idea of shade popping up, and where that it might be interesting to consider how different aspects of that intersect slightly. And to some degree, this might be a rumination about different issues we can't quite connect to each other, but maybe they do have a bit of a connection. So one thing about shade is that it often appears not just as the word tzel in Tanakh, but in the context of being in tzel, in shade, so it's betzel. And one of the most notable instances of this phrase betzel or betzal is in the name of Betzalel. Betzalel is the name of the principal architect of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, of the sort of central structure of the Mikdash, of the Holy Temple. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, "Re'eh karati b'shem Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur lemate Yehuda, v'male oto ruach Elohim b'chochma u'v'tfona u'v'da'at u'v'chol malacha." So see, I have called by the name Betzalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, the tribe of Yehuda, and I filled with him the spirit of God in wisdom and understanding and in knowledge in all kinds of workmanship. And it goes on to describe all the different activities that he can engage in to help build the Mishkan. And then he has this, it's maybe not fair to say sidekick, because in some sense he sounds just as important, but he is mentioned second, which is Oholiav. Wa'ani hini natati ito et Oholiav, Ben Ahisamach lemate Dan, v'lev kol hacham lev natati chochma va'asu et kol asher siviticha. And I've given with him Oholiav, the son of Ahisamach, from the tribe of Dan, and in the hearts of all who are wise I have put the wisdom that they may make all that I have commanded. So this is about having the chokhmah, having the wisdom, the craftsman knowledge to build the Mishkan. But the person who most represents that knowledge has the phrase betzel in his name, and the idea of being in shade, and that's not even something one has to make up oneself, because Chazal give us a midrash that even refers to the idea that Betzalel was hiding in the shade when Moshe was being told how to build the Mishkan by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and so they recognize the idea of shade being contained in the name of Betzalel. So now we have not just the idea that a sukkah gives us shade, and that shade is a good thing. Shade is a nice thing, but also that shade is something that we associate with the wisdom to construct a structure that isn't quite a sukkah in its initial formulation, though we can return to that issue, but which perhaps does provide shade to some degree, and which is the central structure of the Mikdash, of the temple that we built for Hashem, the house that we built for Hashem. And it's interesting also because we sometimes refer to that temple, quoting Amos HaNavi, as a sukkah, in fact, because we have this pasuk in Amos, B'yom hahu akim et sukkat David hanofelet v'gadarti et pirtzehen v'harisotav akim uvnitiha ki yemei olam. And that day I will raise up the tabernacle or sukkah of David that is fallen and repair its breaches, and I will raise up his ruins and will rebuild it as in the days of old. And it actually comments on this pasuk that we're talking about Malchuta Beit David. So it's maybe just the house of David, the kingship of David, but of course you can't really refer to the kingship of David without referring to the idea of Beit HaMikdash, because David and his son Shlomo are the ones who lay the ground for and then build the first Beit HaMikdash, and they really represent not just the idea of ideal Judaic sovereignty in the land of Israel, but also the central activity of that sovereignty, which is to build and operate the Mikdash on Har HaBayit in Yerushalayim. So we do actually have some idea of a sukkah being connected with the Mikdash itself. And for that matter, we certainly have the idea of a tent, right, an ohel, because it's called an ohel moed, or the Mishkan is connected with a literal use of the phrase tent in describing the ohel moed, the tent of meeting that Moshe uses to have his sort of direct encounters with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that becomes the sort of phrase that connects to the idea of the Mishkan as a tent that's constructed out of these curtains that are arranged with poles, etc. And so the Mishkan is more literally and obviously a tent. It may not quite be halachically a sukkah, because there's no mention of a roof made of schach for it, but we certainly have the idea of a shade providing structure that's a little bit temporary seeming or rickety seeming. So whether it's a sukkah, whether it's a tent, we have these ideas swirling around of shade being a good thing, shade being connected with the idea of building the Mishkan, because Bezalel is the craftsman who makes the Mishkan. His partner, Oholiav, has the name Ohel in his name, right? Ohalei Av, like the tents of my father. We now maybe have a little more sense to try to make of that. So I think there are first simple points about why the idea of shade might be connected with the Mishkan and the Mikdash that are almost obvious, I would say. One of which is the idea that if you're in the shade, it's that there's something standing between you and something that's very bright and very powerful, but maybe also kind of harsh and overwhelming, right? That the sun, if you try to relate to it directly, can be too much to bear, and yet you need it, and everything comes from it. And indeed, that produces the temptation, for humankind over time to worship the sun, because we appreciate all our food, in some sense, comes via the sun's light, and the warmth that prevents us from being frozen to death comes from the sun. We need the sun, we love the sun, and yet really trudging around in direct sunlight, especially in these latitudes, can be quite difficult. And so the shade becomes this way of benefiting from the sun, but also being sheltered and being protected, being taken care of, and having something that stands between you and something that is both life-giving and tremendously powerful, but also maybe harsh to relate to directly. And that certainly does fit the idea of a Mishkan, right? Because we're trying to find some way of having an encounter with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world that we can handle. And from Sinai, we have this idea that, the voice of Hashem is related to the idea of a consuming fire that could burn us up. And so there's clearly ways of trying to relate to Hashem too directly that could be sort of overwhelming. And the Mishkan means to bring the experience of Sinai into this world in a way that can be regularly encountered, where we can take the heat, so to speak, and live to tell the tale and survive another day, and have it become kind of part of a routine and part of a seasonal and a daily practice. So in that sense, it makes perfect sense to say that in some sense we're trying to be shaded while relating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the craftsmanship of Betzalel, in the shade. And then the end of Betzalel's name obviously refers to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So is it that he's shading us from something that's too harsh, or is it that we're being shaded from him so that we can relate to him? I think maybe you can have both senses, because then on the other hand, there's this other sense of maybe we're in his shadow. Maybe we're standing below him, like it's sort of a child with a very big looming parent, or a giant standing over us, and we feel this sense of diminution before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he casts a very long shadow, so to speak, and we are sheltering in his shadow, and we both benefit from that closeness to him, but also are very awed by it and are very laid low by it, by this encounter with something much greater than ourselves. So I think both of those points are very simple ways of relating to just really the name of Betzalel. Like, we didn't have to do all this work to connect to the idea of the Sukkah necessarily. But and really not just to Betzalel, but to Ohliav, like whether you're talking about being the shade or you're talking about a tent, the tent provides the shade. Something about what we're talking about with the Mikdash and the Mishkan, it's about tents and shade, and perhaps less directly about the Sukkah. And I'm not sure this exactly relates directly, but I think there's another thing I noticed thinking about this, that it's worth saying about Betzalel, which is just looking at his lineage a little bit. Like, where does Betzalel come from? And we know that he's descended from Kalev, Kalev being one of the spies, the one from Shevet Yehuda, from the tribe of Judah, who's sent into the land at the time when Moshe has the people scouting the land, before the 40 years pass. But Kalev is allowed, along with Hoshea, who becomes Yehoshua, to live to see the day when they go into the land. That Kalev is actually referred to as the progenitor of Betzalel. And we have this, among other places, in Divrei Hayamim. So just pulling that pasuk up. Watamat azuva oikach lo Chalev et Efrat, wataled lo et Hur, vehur holid et Uri, ve'Uri holid et Betzalel. And elsewhere, Betzalel is referred to as the grandson of Hur, although Uri, I think, is maybe, there's also a Buzi. I'm trying to remember who gets also called Buzi elsewhere. Is it Buzi? Let me double check that. I'm not pulling this one up fast enough, so we can try to dig it up later. But I think the point is, Divrei Yamim is giving us a genealogy here for Betzalel, which is a reasonable one, and that we see that it starts with Kalev, presumably Kalev ben Yefune, and then he marries someone named Efrat. We'll comment on that in a second. From that comes Hur, and then Hur, who also is mentioned in the time of Moshe, it turns out is the grandfather of Betzalel. So from Hur you get Uri, and from Betzalel, from Uri you get Betzalel. So what is something to say here? There are a few miscellaneous things to notice. So one thing is that Chazal have a midrash where they tell us that Efrat is actually Miriam, the sister of Moshe. And they're doing that, I think, for a very specific reason, which is just to kind of complete the symmetry of the interweaving of Shevet Yehuda and Shevet Levi in the production of the Mishkan and the Kehuna. Because Aharon HaKohen is from Shevet Levi, and he's going to be the father of the whole Kehuna, but his wife Elisheva is from Shevet Yehuda. And so really, every Kohen is equally descended both from Aaron and Shevet Levi, but also from Shevet Yehuda through Elisheva, the wife of Aaron. And here we're doing something similar, where we're suggesting that Bezalel, who made the Mishkan, although he was from Shevet Yehuda, that actually his mother was Miriam, and so he was no less than a Kohen, a descendant of the family of Moshe. And so it's showing this kind of seamless interwovenness where you can't really pry Yehuda and Levi apart when you're talking about what the temple and its service is. It may be that in practice, the Levim and the Kohanim have the designation of being from Shevet Levi, and Yehuda gets the Malchut, but really genealogically, they're equally involved in both things, if we were trying to trace things all the way back. So maybe that's one purpose of this Midrash from Chazal. I think, though, there's a different point without needing a Midrash to look at, which is that whoever this woman Efrat is, where do we get that word Efrat from? Why would Kalev be married to someone named Efrat? The mention of Efrat that we have in the Torah comes from when? From the death of Rachel Imenu. Vayizra'u mebeit El, wahi od kivrat haaretz lavo Efrata, v'teled Rachel v'tikash belidata. So, and they journeyed from Beit El, and there was but little way to come to Efrat, and Rachel labored with child, and she had a difficult labor. And so this is where she dies, on the road to Bethlehem. And elsewhere that's referred to by Yaakov Avinu, Wa'ani bevo'i mipadan meta alai Rachel be'eretz Kena'an b'derech be'od kivrat eretz lavo Efrata ve'ekbereha sham b'derech Efrat. He Bethlehem, or Bethlehem. So Efrat is mentioned in connection with the burial of Rachel. Why is that significant? Well, Kalev, because he gets to go into the land, he gets to have a nachala in Eretz Yehuda, which is the land of his tribe. He gets to have an inheritance. And what is the inheritance of Kalev? We find out in Sefer Yehoshua, it's Hebron. Okay, so Kalev gets Hebron, which is where all the patriarchs and matriarchs, except for Rachel, are buried. And then Efrat, we find out in Divrei Yamim, the wife of Kalev, is named somehow after the place of the burial of Rachel Imenu. So Kalev and Efrat together are really reuniting the idea of the entire set of patriarchs and matriarchs, the 3 avot and the 4 imahot, implicitly to the degree that Bilhah and Zilpah are connected with Leah and Rachel. So you could add them as well if you wanted, and yet a larger number. But I'm saying, if we're talking about those, the Torah tells us who are buried in Hebron. It's everyone but Rachel. If we go Sarah and Rivka and Leah, and then obviously Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and so Rachel is the one who's left out. So the 6 plus 1 makes 7 of these progenitors, these patriarchs and matriarchs, avot and imahot, are reunited in the idea of Kalev and Efrat. And then what derives from Kalev and Efrat? We go down through the generations and we get Bezalel, the one who makes the Mishkan. So what it took to create the Mishkan was this full unity of all of the parents who gave rise to Bnei Israel that had been separated, and that unity is somehow in connection with their graves, and so it's in connection with this tribal connection to the land, right? Which Kalev demonstrates in his eagerness to come up and conquer the land. Hoshea ben Nun or Yoshua ben Nun is very theologically motivated in how he talks about going up into the land. He said, if Hashem will take us there, if you'll show us the way. And Kalev just says, Alo na'aleh, like let's go up, we can do it. He's very much about the land and the inheritance. Even his name Kalev, is Kalev is like Kelev. It's like a dog digging up the bones, so to speak, right? Like he's going to get his nachla where all the bones are buried, and he has this kind of more basic tribal or animal connection to the land and to his people, and the reunification of that was kind of something was broken apart and scattered a little bit because Rachel wasn't allowed to be buried in Hebron, but through what Kalev creates through his family with Efrat, there's a reunification of that, and that's what leads to, interestingly, Bezalel, who's the one who's capable somehow of now being the one to create the Mishkan. And notice also that the partner of Bezalel is Oholiav, which we said is Ohalei Av, right? The tense of the father. So if you want to talk about, what, if you want to summarize all the stories of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in two most commonly appearing words, or let's say one most commonly appearing word, given that we're talking about avot, right, about patriarchs, it's their tent. They're always talking about they pitch their tent here, they pitch their tent there. So even just this idea of Ohalei Av is also reference somehow to this idea of the avot and imahot and their life and times. And I think in the end, we have to consider that an interesting and perhaps not completely obvious point, because the Mishkan is this ultimate inobvious technology for relating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in all of his Kedusha, in all of his abstractness, in all of his unattainability. And it's something we only really know how to do, seemingly, because we have this elaborate, detailed Torah that gives us instructions for how to do this, right? And so you might think of the Mishkan as being perhaps the most removed aspect of what we're supposed to do, according to the Torah, from the more kind of tribal and national aspects of who we are, because it is supposed to be about an encounter that's out of this world, and it also is about bringing all the nations together into one place. It's all these things that maybe are more universal or also more reaching beyond this material world where we happen to have particular parents in a particular land where we're from, and the blood and soil stuff. But what the Torah is saying is, no, actually, you couldn't have had the one to make the Mishkan. You couldn't have had Bezalel, or really Bezalel and Oholiav, because they're both in their way referring to this idea that we now see, without the sort of the tense of the fathers, right? That the very possibility of this correct mechanism for experiencing the presence of Hashem in this world has to come through this particular tribe of people with their particular bones buried in some particular place that they want to return to, and they want to inherit, and they want to relate to. I don't think this is remotely the only part of the Torah that tries to make this kind of point. And there are other aspects that maybe are more direct, right? The whole life of Abraham is, in some sense, others have, I think, very compellingly argued, for Rav Ezra Bick, for example, of Yeshivat Har Etzion, that Abraham has to transition from a kind of universal mission to humanity to realizing that he has to just try to get things right in his family, and that's more than enough to try to do in one generation, and that his initial inclination perhaps to try to minister to everyone at once and just tell them all about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and imagine that it's all going to work out proves naive in his early encounters with Stone, etc., and that he ultimately has to figure out that no, it has to be someone born from his own seed, and who has the right mother, and then they have a shot at passing something worthwhile on to the next generation that could just really still be the beginning of what eventually is going to transpire. And so you see that elsewhere in the Torah and in other terms, but here we're getting it very directly, that the temple, the Mishkan, we should not imagine somehow that we can ever separate this from the particularism and the national identity, the tribal identity of Am Yisrael, and that that is as it should be. That it is both the case that we should be very pugnaciously like Kalev and say Alo Na'aleh, like let's go up and let's grab onto Hebron because this is where our ancestors are buried, and we can be very let's say, tribally human about just laying hold to a certain inheritance and claiming it as ours and saying this is our territory. And that is actually the foundation for building on top of that something that obviously has all of these other dimensions that eventually invite all of humanity to participate in this opportunity for encounter with the world's creator. But we have to start first with who we are and the particular people that we are and the particular people that Hashem wants to lay the foundations for his house and to build his house in their particular land, in their particular place. By the way, at this particular geographic location where Shevet Binyamin, which comes from Rachel, and Shevet Yehuda, which comes from Leah, are going to meet, and their tribal lands are and going to have this sort of point of intersection where you can make a temple in Jerusalem that doesn't belong to any one tribe. So there is this set of countervailing notions that yes, we are from particular people and we have these sort of separate identities that we're built out of, and those are particular things that we have to relate to and be proud of and connect to in a very visceral and almost animal or at least tribal way. And at the same time, that from that is how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants his particular people to ultimately build something that will make it possible for the universal relationship between him and all of humanity to be enabled correctly. And it's not at all an obvious message. And I think without the Torah, it would be a very difficult one to come up with. But I think that we see as time passes, the wisdom of that and the practical effectiveness of it, and we should all merit to have the opportunity, B'ezrat Hashem, to stand in Hashem's shade, or to use a Mishkan he commanded in his Torah to be shaded from the blinding light of his presence, but still have the opportunity to experience that presence and to relate to it according to his commandments.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.